With the final stretch of campaigning underway, a record number of US voters have cast their votes early. While both candidates intensify their campaign domestically, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Asian countries from India to Indonesia. Hello and a very warm welcome to WION-VOA Co-Production, our weekly special on US election. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, analysts say Secretary Pompeo's announcement this week of a landmark security agreement with India marks another step towards building closer ties and countering China's influence in the region. Here's a report by Voice of America.
During his South Asia tour, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Wednesday announced the opening of a U.S. embassy in the Indian Ocean archipelago nation of Maldives. As on every stop, Pompeo pushed back against what the U.S. views as China's economic exploitation and military aggression in the Indo-Pacific region.
Issues about security in the Maldives and other island nations I've been to, like Micronesia and Sri Lanka, have taken on new importance as the Chinese Communist Party continues its lawless and threatening behavior.
In India this week, Pompeo and Defense Secretary Esper signed landmark security and military agreements. Amid an ongoing border dispute between India and China, Pompeo described the threat from Beijing in stark terms.
The United States will stand with the people of India as they confront threats to their sovereignty and to their liberty.
Analysts say Pompeo visited countries that have received major infrastructure assistance from China, but are now realizing that money came with strings attached.
These countries are also increasingly concerned about China's investments, concerned about financing aspects, debt trap diplomacy, and all that. So I think that for Pompeo, he sees an opportunity to try to capitalize on growing concern about China from within these countries.
Even before Pompeo landed in Sri Lanka, China warned the U.S. not to bully Colombo, which has received huge investment from Beijing. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus responded in a VOA interview on Wednesday.
That's kind of fresh coming from a country that spends their time bullying other countries, whether it's in the South China Sea, or whether it relates to breaking their promises in Hong Kong or Taiwan. This is a country that is used to beating their chest and getting their way in the international community.
Ortega said that at each stop in South Asia, Pompeo has stressed shared democratic values and is grateful to conduct diplomacy face-to-face during the global COVID-19 pandemic. Cindy Sain, VOA News, Washington.
As far as Mike Pompeo's India visit is concerned, let's get in a sense of perspective for that. Let's quickly go across to Voice of America's Nova Purvadi, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. at this hour. Nova, a very good evening to you. Now, India was mentioned disparagingly during the debates, but the Trump administration continues to strengthen ties with India and other South Asian states. What do you make of Trump administration's approach to India?
Yes, it's very interesting because India was mentioned in both presidential debates. The first debate in Cleveland, Ohio, President Trump was insinuating that countries like India and also Russia aren't really forthcoming with COVID numbers. Whereas in the second one, the last one, it was a harsher criticism of pollution in India in relation to climate change. Now, we may be seeing here what I explained earlier in the cycle of personality versus policy, and that seems to be the case in foreign policy as well. President Trump can be very blunt, he can be very upfront, even close allies, traditionally close allies in Europe, feel he's very harsh on them, while not being too harsh on countries like North Korea, Russia, who don't share America's values or interests. But on the ground, there seems to be a stepping up of relations with countries like India, countries like Indonesia also in relation to the South China Sea. This is perhaps an interesting overarching aspect of America's foreign policy, despite what's going on domestically with politics. Of course, America, the U.S. is a little bit behind in courting a lot of these countries especially after China launched
Right.
the Belt Road Initiative in 2013, which involves 70-something countries. But the same countries are now wondering whether the investment was worth it because it came with sort of strings attached. The U.S. itself developed a similar fund in 2018, although the dollar number is not on par with the initiative from Beijing. So we'll continue to see this kind of outreach, whoever wins the election. As for personality versus policy, that is the question on the minds
Right.
of U.S. voters, especially Republicans. Republicans who may not like his 2 a.m. tweets, who may not like his tweet storms, his bluntness, but are fine with his policies, Akansha.
Absolutely, and as far as foreign policy goes, it seems that Trump administration has certainly scored its brownie points, at least with India. Having said that, Nova, based on the number of early voters, it looks like we are set to see record turnout in this election. What's your assessment?
Well, yes, two things that we in the U.S. U.S.-based journalists following this election, we're looking at one, polling in battleground states, key battleground states, Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, states like Texas, which are usually safely Republican, safely red, but now a little bit purple in the urban and suburban areas. We're looking at these polls, but we're also glued to this website, United States Election Project, among others by the University of Florida, and its analyst there, Michael McDonald. We're glued to that because they are tallying the early voting numbers, which are hitting record numbers. The latest number was 82 million voters. That's only, with a few days to go till the election. Whereas the total number of voters in 2016 was around 130 voters. So this is already a significant chunk of that vote. Michael McDonald thinks that this year we could have a turnout of 65%, which hasn't really happened in the U.S. in over a century. Actually, the last time an election was turnout was 60% was in 1968, and since then it's only been roughly half of Americans, including the last two elections where participation was 55%. Now, one of the groups that are driving early voting are youth voters, which is interesting because youth voters have earned a reputation for attending rallies but never showing up at the polls. They're usually considered, under 30-year-olds are usually considered an unreliable voting bloc. But this year, they're coming to the polls early and voting by mail in droves. The highest youth participation, youth voter participation, was in the 2008 election, which ended with the victory of Barack Obama from the Democratic Party. That one was 48%. And it has declined ever since, but what looks to be likely to happen in this election is it might exceed the 48% in 2008. And so those are, the driving factors, and of course COVID, with the frustration over COVID, and also the fear of long lines if they wait till election day, and that's what seems to be driving a lot of people to the polls early, Akansha.
Absolutely, very well said, Nova. I'm also going to touch upon another crucial hot topic of discussion, which is of course racism that continues to disturb US election. Philadelphia City Council has passed a bill banning the use of tear gas, rubber bullets and pepper spray during the protests. Is this move going to help cool the burning city down? Well,
the issue has been a hot button issue since June with the Black Lives Matter rallies that seems to have gripped the nation. But it has also splintered, sort of solidified the positions of both Democrats and Republicans, with Republicans more keen to more keen to support a law and order approach, whereas Democrats see systemic racism as behind the grievances of the Black Lives Matter issue. Now, the interesting thing is this is in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia and Pennsylvania will be the focus on election night because it wasn't a swing state until last election. It used to be a solidly blue state, which voted Democratic for the previous 6 elections. That state was considered a shoe-in, and Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, was born there, and so usually someone a candidate's birth state helps them in that state. But obviously no one is taking Pennsylvania for granted. So this is yet again one of the polarizing issues, and also something that could decide in a state like Pennsylvania, which has conducted early voting as well, but it is still, it still has to count the votes, including on election day, Akansha.
That certainly is one issue which is plaguing the US election at the moment. Let's also talk about disinformation. For that, let's bring our viewers a report. The current US election campaign has been marred by disinformation. The spread of fake news makes the search for trustworthy news that is much harder. But as VOA's Tina Trin reports, tech companies are now identifying media bias and helping readers discern the real news from the fake. Here's a report.
Between Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other ways Americans get their news online, many may be experiencing information overload in the run-up to Election Day. And some information isn't necessarily accurate or even true.
8 in 10 Americans are now concerned that misinformation will play a role in the outcome of the election.
But would most Americans be able to spot misinformation if they saw it?
We are expecting the news consumer to actually do the work and recognize, is this news true? Is this biased? Is it not?
That's why Harleen Kaur and her co-founders started Ground News, which claims to be the world's first news comparison platform.
So say it's a political story about elections, we'll show you how all the way from far left to far right are covering it, so you can compare.
Ground News' browser extension provides this immediately for stories.
With a single click, you can then figure out what else is available. What are the other spins on the same story?
We are all biased. We're biased by everything we know, by our life experience, and everything we don't know.
John Gable is the co-founder of AllSides.com, a site that provides media bias ratings and identifies left, center, and right takes on the headlines.
We automatically bring out different points of view. So our first 3 results of any search you do on a news story will give you 3 different perspectives on that same topic.
User experience researchers like Samir Patil have found that any additional guidance can help reduce the spread of misinformation.
And this doesn't have to be very lengthy or extensive, just a short blurb that says this might be questionable, or you might want to look further into it. Just that brief intervention acts as a check and reduces people's tendency or intention to share it.
Ultimately, a healthy dose of skepticism is needed.
Just at least think about, is this likely to be true? Are there factors that may make it not true? Just that brief pause and reflecting might be useful here.
This election season and beyond, it's one way to separate the real news from the fake news. Tina Trin, VOA News, New York.
To speak more about how disinformation could affect voters, let's quickly go back to Voice of America's Nova Parvati, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Nova, the spread of fake news during the 2016 election was one topic that was widely studied and probed. How much have things changed ever since for this election cycle?
Well, Akansha, at least people have greater awareness of misinformation, of fake news. Unfortunately, a lot of people still label fake news to any news that they don't like, instead of, fake news being news that is fake from an inaccurate source, unresearched source. So at least now a lot of people are aware of fake news. A lot of the campaigns are aware of fake news. a lot of officials are aware of fake news, and there are more now consultants working with local officials to dispel or to push back against fake news. A lot of fake news usually spreads on social media, and a lot of them are also fought on social media as well. Now, Facebook and Twitter, two of the main social media platforms, have taken action also against fake news. Twitter was quick and decisive in labeling items as questionable, whereas Facebook in the beginning was sort of saying that social media shouldn't be the gateway to determine fake news, but now they do have prompts that show you resources to verify anything being posted. You post a selfie, but if it says vote, there's a prompt to show you resources for voting. And this was also intensified during COVID. Any claim which is questionable about COVID, there would be a prompt to research it further. So it is, the environment is certainly better. What's not clear is whether users themselves have gotten more adept at spotting fake news. More and more people are getting their political news on social media websites. Pew Research Center said that 1 in 5 Americans get most of their news on social media, as opposed to local news, cable news, newspapers, which used to be, which were on the decline, but somewhat got a boost after the 2016 election in terms of subscriptions. But younger voters, especially 18 to 29, almost half of them rely on social media. And this, of course, opens the risk also of the so-called echo chamber, where algorithms only point you to like-minded posts and views, and so you don't get to see the opposing side, Akansha.
That's in fact a very crucial point that you're making, that younger voters who are of course more aware as far as and are of course participating more actively in this election are going to be affected by social media. Also, let me now talk about the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis has now released this report, which of course talks about the latest GDP for this year's third quarter that has also projected a record growth. Is this report now going to impact Donald Trump and his ratings, which had dipped during the polls?
Well, interesting, because it's a 33 point something percent is a record number. But of course, that came after the devastation that was the second quarter, March, with the lockdowns and everything. Of course, definitely this has been seized by both candidates. Donald Trump saying it's a record number, a proof of proof that his policies are bearing fruit, but also at the same time, Joe Biden is saying that this wouldn't have happened had it not crashed in Q2 in the second quarter. And of course, we still face the colder months and possible more new lockdowns, as we're seeing in Europe, and that could dampen economic activity further. We're getting close to peak consumer spending season. Consumer spending is a large chunk of the U.S. economic activity. And as long as that remains healthy, usually the U.S. economy is healthy. But we don't know yet whether it's going to be suppressed by the many joblessness, the many people who are out of work, and also the lack of stimulus that that Congress and the White House have not agreed to before the elections. There was hope at one point that there would be a stimulus package before the election, but after the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice, the Senate has adjourned, so there will be no talks until after the election. So certainly both sides are seizing this selectively, perhaps for their own interests, and it could go either way. But as we mentioned, 82 million voters have already made up their minds and counting, because a lot of the early voters are now in the most populous states in the U.S., California, Texas, Florida, and also
Absolutely.
New York. New York was the most recent to start opening their polls, Akansha.
It's interesting that you mentioned that much talked about stimulus package, which I think and I believe is being used as a bait for the voter in US. Having said that, let's now finally talk about the results. The election is next Tuesday, just days away now from the election. But how soon can we expect the election results, Nova?
Akansha, on an ordinary, a regular election, I would say that by 6 p.m. Eastern time in the U.S., which is around 3:30 a.m.
But this is no ordinary election. You and I both know.
The polls would have started. Yes. Exactly, because usually we'd know by around midnight, you'd know, before midnight, you'd know, which is around 9:30 a.m. The next day in India. But this is no ordinary election, as you said. So many people have sent in their ballots. So many people have voted early. The thing with absentee or mail-in ballots is not every state immediately processes or counts them as they arrive. And this could cause a logistical kind of backlog on election day. One state that I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania, they're one example. All eyes will be on them as well on election night. But their laws call for the processing, the counting of absentee ballots to start on election day. So we may not know the final tally until November 6th on Friday, next time we meet. And so those are the complications that have led a lot of people here to expect an election week instead of an election day. However, there are several key battleground states that could give an early indication of how this election is going to be. One of them is, of course, Florida and also North Carolina. Florida is a battleground and swing state, and they actually have been very, they've beefed up and they've basically been the most prepared.
Absolutely,
with
it was
ballots.
quite a dueling
So despite
rally.
the fact that many people voted.
Absolutely, it was a dueling rally.
And you know, Florida, despite the fact that they had more absentee voting this time, they are more prepared to count on time. So we can still expect Florida to maybe call the state by midnight, around midnight Eastern, which would be 9:30 a.m. in New Delhi. So we could get an earlier indication.
Absolutely. Very rightly said, it will be the absentee voting that will be, of course, spelling the shift for this election, which, of course, as you rightly pointed out, is not an ordinary election. Can't wait to see you, Nova, next week on November 6th. For now, thank you so much for bringing in all those precious inputs from the United States. And that brings me to the end of WION-VOA Co-Production. We'll be back next week with all the latest on US election results. Thank you so much for watching.